Quelle est l'origine des mots, les syntaxes, l'épistémologie du mot logistique? Quelqu'un peut répondre? C'est une question très stupide, oui. Quelle est la logistique? Quelle est l'origine du mot, du concept?
The military.
Quelles sont les significances? C'est très intéressant parce qu'il vient de la grecque, logistica. Et la définition étymologique, c'est exactitude de calcul. C'est ça l'origine de logistique. Bon, je pense que c'est très intéressant parce que quand on a dans cette affaire de logistique, notre cliente, le marché, cherchait peut-être une chose que c'est très important comme part de la proposition des valeurs, que c'est certitude. La certitude, c'est au cours, c'est peut-être les compétences médulaires dans les affaires de logistique. Alors, est-ce que vous avez ou est-ce que vous connaissez une présentation de comment est-ce que un cluster logistique ça va? Comment est-ce que le cluster logistique marche? Est-ce que vous avez une présentation? Have you ever seen a logistics cluster? Ok, intéressant. Ok, on va commencer. La première chose, c'est on est ici parce que vraiment on voudrait élever notre capacité de concurrence, oui. Mais pour moi, les définitions plus exactes et plus élégantes de concurrence, et spécialement concurrence à niveau régional ou national, c'est très simple. Les concurrences, on les trouve par rapport à qu'est-ce qu'on fait, ou comment est-ce qu'on fait les choses. De quelle manière? Ce n'est pas un de what, c'est plus sûr un de how. Il y a des secteurs régnants, il y a des entreprises régnantes aussi, Victor, mais aussi des entreprises et des industries qui ne sont pas attractives. Si on parle par rapport à l'industrie de l'aviation, on va trouver que cette industrie a vraiment perdu beaucoup d'argent. Mais il y a des entreprises comme peut-être Virgin, qui sont très profitables, mais c'est une industrie très difficile. L'industrie qui c'est le plus profitable du monde, c'est l'industrie des boissons et aussi des santé. C'est les deux industries les plus attractives du monde. Mais dans cette industrie, il y a des entreprises qui ne sont pas profitables. Mais les choses plus importantes dans le processus de concurrentiel national, c'est comment est-ce qu'on fait des choses. Pas nécessairement quelles choses on fait. Alors, c'est ça des idées qui je pense que c'est un peu différent par rapport à les développements dans le milieu maritime global. Peut-être on accepte une chose. Peut-être l'innovation plus disruptive et radicale aux dernières 20 années est être les containers. Oui? Comment est-ce que vous dites container en français? Conteneur. Contenedor en espagnol. El contenedor. Mais c'est vraiment formidable. Mais aussi, il y a un mouvement qui c'est l'intégration des chaînes de valeur. Et si on peut analyser l'activité dans ce secteur des Chinois, c'est formidable. Les Chinois cherchent le contrôle des portes et l'architecture des portes. Aussi, il a le plus meilleur numéro de cargos du monde, peut-être, il est très, très actif dans l'industrie des assurances, mais aussi, il commence une intégration très intéressante parce que les cargos, c'est la même chose, un entrepôt, une usine et aussi un centre de distribution. Mais les cargos, c'est pas un cargo maintenant. C'est comme ça une unité de production. C'est une révolution très importante. Et quand on combine le développement de cette intégration, le contrôle de la chaîne de valeur de la logistique maritime, avec la réalité de que plus en plus la manufacture, la production locale d'articles, c'est plus facile par rapport à la nouvelle technologie comme le 3D printing. On a vraiment un défi intéressant. Aussi, la réduction d'activité économique au monde a généré un excès de capacité dans des secteurs. Et c'est un problème aussi. Alors, la question fondamentale pour moi dans ce secteur, et je ne suis pas un expert, mais je suis peut-être un observante externe. Est-ce qu'on a un facilitateur de commerce ou est-ce qu'on peut faire quelque autre chose plus important, plus relevante? Est-ce qu'on va faire les victimes ou les bénéficiaires du commerce? Mais les questions débat, est-ce qu'on peut faire un rôle de protagonisme dans les chaînes de valeur globales, plusieurs jusqu'un facilitateur. Alors, la réponse est oui, mais on doit embrasser, on doit adopter une l'approche du cluster. OK? On va commencer pour l'entendant de suivantes choses. Je vais changer anglais maintenant. Oui. Et après espagnol. Bon. OK. Now you see, this is a very interesting graph actually because it actually combines the growth of real GDP per capita and the actual GDP per capita of Latin America and the Caribbean. And you see a few countries are really doing very well. Obviously, Venezuela is going this way. Mexico it's just trying to remain stable. And you have Panama as a really, really great country. Brazil is going down, obviously. But the interesting thing about this is how dispersed the performance of countries are. This is the growth, and this is the actual level of GDP per capita. Well, it's 2013, but it really hasn't changed a lot. And this is for the last 11 years. So what's interesting is to witness the difference in national performance. And a lot has to do with how well these countries are interconnected. Look, Panama is really the champion. And Panama is the logistics hub of the Americas, right? Another thing which is interesting, Chile is a very interesting example of a country where everything is 8-9 hours away by air. They're very isolated, but yet they export tremendously around the world. Now, one of the things that's very important, c'est la compréhension de la science de croissance. Comment est-ce que des pays, des régions, faire des croissance économique, développement économique? Comment se faire ça? Alors, c'est une question très importante parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup d'études vraiment à niveau longitudinal qui peut comparer et utiliser beaucoup des nations et aussi des années pour découvrir quelles variables sont les plus significatives, les plus importantes qui définissent et qui influencent la croissance des pays. Jeffrey Sachs, il est un économiste de l'University of Columbia, New York. And one of the things that he actually have identified in the most serious and sophisticated work in research in how countries grow, he identified basically 4 very important variables that affect growth. Number 1, but is open markets. If a country, if a region, has a free market, it's an open market where we have plenty of free flows of trade and services. That defines about 65 to 70% of the capacity of a country to grow. Does that make sense? Okay? It is fascinating. And the reason is because what really drives global growth is global trade. And then the other variable, not as important as consistent open markets, is the growth in the country of economically active population. And then institutional quality, and then central government budget balance. So these are the most positive impact variables. And then the most negative variables in growth is basically the share of natural resource exports in GDP. If I depend on oil and gas for most of my exports, that actually hurts my capacity to grow. If I am already a high-level country in terms of my GDP, that actually is an obstacle to keep growing. If I'm a tropical location, that's not good. Yeah, and if I'm in a landlocked location, that's not good either. So we think about Trinidad and Tobago. We don't have an open market. The active population is actually decreasing, not increasing. The institutional quality is still not there, by far. And we have been carrying deficits in the last 6 years. So that is what is not allowing us to grow. But on top of that, we have all the obstacles. Most of our exports are based on gas and oil and gas. Bad. We already are a kind of middle income country, so we're kind of quite rich, comparatively speaking. We are in a tropical location. And even though we're not landlocked, we are anyway isolated. We're sea locked, which actually is the same thing as being landlocked. So God bless us, right? Now, why clusters are important? So, and what are they? Look, this is basically one of the most important models for competitiveness. You know, the development of a country or of a region starts with natural endowments, and then you have social and infrastructure and political institutions, macroeconomic policies, and then the microeconomics starts to kick in. You have quality of national business environment, then the sophistication of company operations and strategy, and then the state of cluster development. Would you like to see some examples of what a cluster looks like? Yeah? I don't feel the love. If I don't feel love, I'm just going to. So that's the definition of clusters. So this is very academic, but it's important, right? Remember, I'm a professor, so I have to do these things. Okay? So it's really a geographic agglomeration of compatible, complementary activities around the same value chain. Okay? That's really what it is. And what's interesting about the notion of cluster is that it's full of paradoxes. Whenever you belong to a cluster, it means that you compete and you collaborate at the same time. La concurrence et la collaboration au même temps. C'est très difficile. And what's interesting is the more competition, the healthier is the cluster, which is interesting. And usually a cluster is composed by 5 different elements. Companies, which are really at the heart of the cluster. You have governments, special government institutions. You have institutions for collaboration that really and truly are the ones who actually put together all these actors. Financial institutions and the research community, which usually is about universities. And we have to stop thinking about sectors, and we have to start thinking a little bit more about clusters. Because, you think about a sector like the maritime sector, we're making the assumption that we operate in isolation. But let me tell you one thing, and this is very important. It does not matter what type of cluster are we talking about. Agriculture cluster, energy cluster, tourism cluster, mining cluster. It doesn't matter which one you talk about. There's always the need for two activities within every cluster: financial services and logistics. Whenever you operate in such small markets like we are, in islands that we are isolated, there are 4 or 5 fundamentals that we have to be very, very keen whenever we think about clusters. We have to think about a cluster that allows us to develop some level of food security, some level of energy security, environmental security, health security, and logistics security. Right? One of the things that is important in a cluster is that it really emphasizes the need for exploiting in a productive way linkages. Okay? So there's many, many examples of clusters, which let me just start with the one that I think is easier. It's really an introduction to clusters. This is the Peruvian cluster in Cusco, where Machu Picchu is. Anybody have visited Machu Picchu, Peru? You've been there. You like it, sir? In your dreams? What are you drinking, Bordeaux or tequila? You don't drink? Now, this is very interesting, because if you think about that, a cluster, the heart of the cluster is based on what we call the anchor firms or the anchor activities. The anchor activities in any tourism cluster starts with attractions and activities. In this case, Machu Picchu and the city of Cusco is one of the most fundamental attractions. But once we have that, you have restaurants, you have food, you have accommodations, and you have transport. That is how every single tourism cluster works. Doesn't matter which one, if it's Australia, if it's the Netherlands, Guadeloupe, etc. It works like that. And you can have the best hotel in the world and the best restaurant in the world, but if there is not enough attractions to support the demand, it won't work. You can be the best entrepreneur, you can be the best hotelier, but if there is not enough attractions, it's not going to work. So for instance, it's something that, if you ask me, Jamaica is a beautiful example of how this is working. They're exploiting their natural resources. They're building, attractions around their beautiful beaches. And not only that, they are building lots of infrastructure. They're connecting now the city of Kingston with the northern part of Jamaica, cutting, I think, the transportation time in about 1/3 or so. 2/3, sorry, sir, 2/3. My bad. And the richness of attractions is not only based on the beaches, it's as well based on the food, on the musical heritage. So there's a quite interesting and sophisticated portfolio of attractions. So it's working, it's working. Now, in support of this core, of this anchor of firms, you have travel agents and tour operators, and then you have all these different inputs to the actual core activities. You have marketing agencies, food suppliers, property services, maintenance services, hospitality equipment suppliers, and then you have other retail sector, crafts, banking services, and look at the related clusters. Food and health. That is critical. So, logistics here, right? Very critical. This is the example of what a cluster is. Questions? Would you like to see other examples? Or this is enough? Other example. Okay. This is the same tourism cluster, but in Australia. And do you see? It's the same bloody logic. Basically, very little change, which is the dirty secret about clusters. They have very similar logic across the world. Very similar logic. Now, let's see another one. The Mexico's chocolate cluster. Les chocolats mexicains, les meilleurs du monde. Oui? Non? Oui, bien sûr. Après le quoi? Après Martinique? On a un problème. Alors, so at the center of the cluster, you have the chocolate production. You have large manufacturers and small manufacturers. But critical to this, you have all the suppliers of inputs, intermediaries, right? And business services, financial services. And then you have distribution and sales, where logistics is a very important part. And not only that, look, the industry associations, the regulators, and the infrastructure. The key is how you make this work in a deliberate way. Vous vous demandez l'émergence du cluster d'un pays en voie de développement, c'est pas une stratégie délibérée. C'est une stratégie émergente. C'est pas les gouvernements qui de manière délibérée,
c'est pour l'inviter à conclure.
Peut-être avec l'utilisation des policies et d'autres types de décisions au niveau gouvernemental qui suggéraient le manche de cluster. The real challenge in the clusters here is, especially if you want to grow in a cluster, is to understand what drives the growth in the cluster. So what drives the growth in the cluster usually are the anchor activities. The more attractions you have in a tourism cluster, the better.
Monsieur Carrillo, je sais que vous parlez français, je sais que vous me comprenez.
Oui.
Je vous invite simplement à
1 minute?
conclure.
Okay.
Allez, 30 secondes.
30 secondes.
Ouais.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
I'm going to basically now use my 30 seconds to talk about logistics clusters. I think this is the theme of the conference, right? So would you like, I know, can I have 60 seconds? Because we're talking about, I cannot talk about logistics clusters if we don't have an introduction to clusters, right? So let's talk about logistics clusters. And to do that, we have to understand another cluster, which is the Kenya's flower cluster. This is how it works. Flower farming and post-harvest handling. This is very important. This is at the heart. But look at how important is all the different activities related to the logistics sophistication for this particular cluster. You need cool technology. You need refrigerated trucks, freight forwarders, and so on and so forth. Air carriers. Now, the key here is what type of cluster you want. Do you want a logistics zone, a logistics cluster, which includes a terminal, or logistics poles that includes distribution centers, terminals, or ports, which I think this is what you want to become, a pole, more like a cluster or a zone. These are examples of what logistics clusters look like, and more so maritime in Athens. So you have the Athens shipping, and you have maritime services, and you have maritime equipment and suppliers. And look at the sophistication. This cluster took 2,000 years to develop. This is the most of it. You really want to know how a maritime cluster works, go to Athens. Very important. Now, this is the logistics clusters in Dubai. Okay? And it looks very similar everywhere, but you have land transport, handling agents, logistics providers, and storage and warehousing, port operations, or airport cargo, shipping lines, airlines, and everything across. We are far away from becoming a very well orchestrated clusters in logistics, as you can see. This is how the cluster, the maritime transportation cluster works in Miami. This is a Miami cluster. Okay? You have shipping freight, cruise passengers, transport, the port, and then you have very close link between the agriculture and tourism cluster and all these complementary activities that support the core. That is how a logistics cluster looks like.
Très bien. Un mot de conclusion, Monsieur Carrillo, s'il vous plaît.
These are the advantages of operating a logistics cluster. First of all, you develop economies of scope in transport because you have several options, not only one. You have economies of scale because you have more merchandise, and economies of density because in a pole, you're able to actually use several means of transportation and warehousing than if it's distributed across different territories. You have frequency economies, which is something that we don't have here. I don't know, anybody who travels, we can share assets with other logistics companies, especially labor. You can have expansion capacity, and you can as well share labor. Now, at the end, and this is my conclusion, I'm sorry for using more time. Well, actually, I'm not. Yes, the key here is, are we going to just sit down as a cluster and wait for the demand to come, or we can do something about it? So I think that whenever we are in this business of logistics, we really have to be generators of demand. And in this term, the competencies are the core, at the heart of this business, are obviously e-commerce, tracking, demand planning, and the logistics companies becoming really companies that orchestrate solutions. Not only transportation, but as well warehousing, commercialization, maintenance, and everything that could help around the supply and value chain. Merci beaucoup.